If you look at a map of Britain today, it looks like a small island sitting on the edge of Europe. It does not look like the home of the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. But if you look a little more carefully at a map of the entire world, you will find that Britain still controls 14 overseas territories spread across every ocean on the planet. From Gibraltar at the entrance of the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to the Falkland Islands deep in the South Atlantic Ocean, these places are the last surviving pieces of what was once the greatest empire in all of human history. At the very peak of its power, just over 100 years ago, the British Empire covered 1/4 of all the land on Earth and ruled over nearly 1/3 of the entire human population. Think about that for a moment. One country on one small island controlled 1 in every 3 people alive on this planet. It was so large that the sun was always shining on some part of it. People called it the Empire, on which the sun never set. But how did this happen? How did a small and rainy island off the coast of Northern Europe grow to dominate the entire world? That is the story we are going to tell today. This is the entire history of the British Empire. To understand how the British Empire was built, you have to go back even before Britain existed as a country, because the foundations of the empire were laid long before the nation that would build it had even been created. For most of its history, the most powerful kingdom in the British Isles was the Kingdom of England. England had a strong economy, a capable military, and a well-organized system of government. Over many centuries, England gradually brought Wales and much of Ireland under its control, but to the north, the Kingdom of Scotland remained fiercely independent. The Scottish people had resisted English invasions for hundreds of years, and they were not going to give up their independence easily. By the early 1600s, the English Queen Elizabeth I had started sending explorers out into the wider world. She issued licenses to adventurers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher, who sailed to distant lands and claimed them in the name of England. But claiming land and actually building a settlement, there are two very different things, and England struggled badly at first. The first English colony in North America was set up at Roanoke Island in 1585, and it ended in complete disaster. Every single colonist simply vanished without a trace. Nobody knows to this day what happened to them. Despite these failures, Elizabeth also set up something far more important for the future of the empire. She granted royal charters to trading companies. These were organizations set up specifically to do business in distant parts of the world. The Levant Company, founded in 1592, traded with the Middle East. The East India Company, founded in 1600, was given a monopoly over all English trade with Asia. These companies would eventually become more powerful than most governments. If you want to understand how the modern world was built, you need to understand one empire above all others. Subscribe to Backdoor Economics and never miss a story that changed the world. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the English throne passed to James VI of Scotland. This was a very important moment because it meant that one man was now the king of both England and Scotland at the same time. The two kingdoms were not yet merged into one country, but they were now ruled by the same person, and that changed everything. King James was ambitious. He wanted to build proper overseas colonies, not just claim distant lands on paper. Under his rule, the English developed a system of 3 different types of colonies. First, there was the Crown Colony, which was ruled directly by the king through a governor he appointed himself. Then, there was the Charter Colony, which was run by a company under a royal license, and gave colonists much more freedom to govern themselves. Finally, there was the Proprietary Colony, which was managed by a wealthy individual, often the head of a trading company who controlled the land for profit. One of the most important but often forgotten events of this time was something called the Plantation of Ulster in the north of Ireland. The English and Scottish crown moved thousands of Protestant settlers from Scotland and England into the northern part of Ireland. This was organized colonization on a large scale, and it created a blueprint for how the English would build colonies in other parts of the world. Many of the people who organized the Ulster Plantation later went on to set up colonies in North America. During the 1600s, England built colonies right across the Caribbean and along the eastern coast of North America. Some of these were started from scratch, and others were taken by force from rival countries. New York, for example, was seized from the Dutch in 1665. England also built trading posts along the coasts of Africa and in the East Indies. And in 1660, the Royal African Company was created. This company would go on to become one of the biggest operators in the transatlantic slave trade, one of the most brutal chapters in the entire history of the empire. Scotland tried to build its own colonial empire during this period, but it failed completely. Scottish settlers attempted colonies in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, and Carolina, but none of them lasted. The worst failure came in 1698 with what became known as the Darien Scheme. Scotland raised an enormous amount of money from ordinary people, nearly 1/5 of all the wealth in the country, to fund a colony on the Isthmus of Panama. The idea was to control the land route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and become incredibly rich from trade. The colonists called their settlement Caledonia and built a small town they named New Edinburgh. But the whole scheme collapsed quickly under the pressure of food shortages, tropical diseases, and attacks from Spanish forces. By the time the survivors returned home, Scotland was in a deep financial crisis. It had lost most of its national wealth in a single failed adventure. This disaster left Scotland with few options. Many Scottish leaders concluded that their only real path to prosperity was to join with England and share in the wealth of its growing empire. And so, in 1707, the Acts of Union were passed in both parliaments. England and Scotland merged into a single country called Great Britain, with one shared parliament sitting in London. Once Great Britain was formed, it entered a period of almost constant warfare with the other great powers of Europe. These wars were not just fought in Europe, they were fought wherever Britain and its rivals had colonies and trading posts, which meant they were truly global conflicts. After the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, Britain came out as one of the big winners. The peace agreement handed Britain control of Newfoundland and Acadia in North America, as well as the strategically important Mediterranean islands of Gibraltar and Minorca. Meanwhile, far away in India, the British East India Company was fighting a different kind of war. In 1757, the company won a decisive battle at Plassey, defeating the local ruler of Bengal and pushing out French influence in the region. This victory turned the East India Company into the most powerful military and political force in India. From that point on, the company used a combination of direct conquest and threats of force to expand its territory across the whole subcontinent. It was not technically part of the British Empire at this stage. It was a private company, but it was acting like an empire all the same. The 7 Years' War, which ran from 1756 to 1763, changed the map of the world dramatically. Britain captured Quebec in 1759 and effectively ended French power in North America. By 1760, the whole of New France had come under British control. Spain was also forced to give up Florida. For a brief moment in history, Britain controlled nearly the entire eastern coast of North America. The peace treaty that ended the war, signed in Paris in 1763, also handed Britain several Caribbean islands, including Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Tobago. At the heart of everything the British Empire did was trade. The empire was built on two foundations that always worked together: control of the seas and control of commerce. Britain's navy was the strongest in the world, and that allowed British merchants to sail anywhere and trade with anyone without fear. The taxes collected on goods passing through British ports made the country incredibly wealthy. But this system had a serious weakness. The colonies that produced all this wealth were not treated the same as people living in Britain itself. They paid taxes to the British government, but they had no voice in that government. They had no representation in Parliament. During the 1760s and 1770s, this became a very serious problem in Britain's 13 colonies along the American coast. The colonists argued that it was completely wrong to tax them without giving them any say in how they were governed. They saw it as a betrayal of the rights that any English person was supposed to enjoy. The tension grew and grew until it finally broke in 1775, when the colonists took up arms against British rule. The following year, in 1776, the leaders of the colonies gathered together and officially declared independence from Britain. The war lasted 8 years. Britain sent soldiers to crush the rebellion, but it could not win. In the end, Britain was forced to recognize the United States of America as a fully independent nation. It was the most humiliating defeat in British history up to that point, and it forced the empire to completely rethink its strategy. Part 5. A New Direction. After losing America, Britain shifted its attention toward Asia, the Pacific, and Africa. There were vast territories in these parts of the world that had not yet been colonized by any European power, and Britain was determined to get there first. One of the most important figures in this new phase of expansion was Captain James Cook. Cook sailed across the Pacific Ocean in the 1770s, mapping coastlines and claiming lands that no European had ever charted before. He mapped New Zealand and the entire eastern coast of Australia before being killed in Hawaii during his third voyage. The lands he discovered opened the door to a whole new phase of British colonization. Australia was first used as a place to send convicted criminals. Before the American Revolution, Britain had transported criminals to the American colonies. Now it needed somewhere else to send them. The first ships carrying convicts arrived in New South Wales in 1788, and Australia began its long journey from a penal settlement to one of the most important parts of the empire. Further north in the Pacific, British explorers like George Vancouver and Alexander Mackenzie were mapping the western coast of North America in the 1790s. This opened up the region to British fur traders and merchants, and gradually pushed the boundaries of British North America all the way to the Pacific. Part 6. Napoleon and the Wars that Reshaped the World. In 1803, a new threat emerged that would test Britain like nothing before. Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power in France, and he was building an empire of his own that stretched across most of Europe. Britain faced the very real possibility of invasion, and it poured enormous resources into its military to fight back. The most decisive moment of these wars came at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The British Navy, under Admiral Lord Nelson, faced the combined naval forces of France and Spain and completely destroyed them. Nelson himself was killed during the battle, but his victory secured something priceless. Britain would now have complete and unchallenged control over the world's oceans for the next 140 years. No other country's navy could match it. That dominance over the sea was the foundation on which everything else the empire built was possible. When the Napoleonic Wars finally ended in 1815, Britain emerged as the undisputed winner. The peace settlements handed Britain control of a whole series of new territories taken from the defeated powers. The Ionian Islands, Malta, Mauritius, St. Lucia, the Seychelles, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Ceylon, and the Cape Colony in southern Africa all became British possessions. The empire was now bigger and more powerful than it had ever been before. It was also around this time that the question of slavery became impossible to ignore. Britain had profited enormously from the slave trade over the previous 2 centuries. The Royal African Company and its successors had transported hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. But the Industrial Revolution was changing the British economy, and merchants were beginning to realize they could make more money from manufactured goods than from slave-produced crops. Political campaigners were also putting more and more pressure on the government to act. The slave trade within the British Empire was abolished in 1807. Slavery itself, however, continued for another 27 years. The full abolition of slavery in all British territories did not come until 1834. Part 7. The Imperial Century. The period from 1815 to 1914 is often called Britain's Imperial Century, and for good reason. During these 100 years, the British Empire expanded to cover more of the earth than any empire in history had ever controlled before. In Asia, the East India Company continued pushing outward. Singapore was established as a trading post in 1819 and became a full colony by 1824. In China, Britain fought the First Opium War and forced China to hand over Hong Kong and open Shanghai to British trade in 1842. The empire was reaching into every corner of Asia. But then, in 1857, everything nearly fell apart in India. Local soldiers in the East India Company's army, called sepoys, rose up against their British commanders in what became known as the Sepoy Rebellion, or the Indian Mutiny. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but it shook the British government to its core. They concluded that the East India Company could no longer be trusted to govern a country of hundreds of millions of people. In 1858, the British government took direct control of India. The jewel in the crown, as India was called, now belonged directly to the crown. Another major challenge during this period came from Russia. The Russian Empire was expanding southward and westward, trying to fill the space left by the weakening Ottoman Empire. Britain feared that Russian expansion would threaten its control over the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the routes to India. When Russia attacked Ottoman-controlled territory in 1853, Britain and France both went to war on the side of the Ottomans. The Crimean War lasted until 1856 and ended in defeat for Russia. Britain then negotiated further arrangements with Russia in 1878 to divide Central Asia into separate spheres of influence. That same year, Britain also gained control of Cyprus from the Ottomans as an additional protective measure. In Africa, Britain was consolidating and expanding at the same time. In the south, British settlers moved into the Cape Colony in large numbers during the 1820s, pushing Dutch-descended settlers called Boers further into the interior. The Boers eventually set up their own independent republics, called the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, but both were ultimately absorbed into the British Empire after the Second Anglo-Boer War ended in 1902. In North Africa, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 was a turning point. The canal connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean and cut the travel time between Britain and India enormously. Britain could not afford to let any rival power control such a critical route, and in 1882 it occupied Egypt militarily, even though Egypt was not officially considered a British colony. The last decades of the 19th century saw what historians call the scramble for Africa. The great European powers rushed to claim as much African territory as possible before anyone else could get there. Britain came out of the scramble controlling most of eastern and southern Africa. There were even ambitious plans to build a continuous railway from the Cape of Good Hope all the way to Cairo, linking the entire eastern side of Africa under British control. The railway was never completed, but the ambition behind it tells you everything about how vast British power in Africa had become. By the year 1900, Britain was not just the biggest empire in the world. It was also the world's leading trading nation, and considered itself the global policeman. Its economic reach extended far beyond its formal empire. Countries like China, Argentina, and many others operated under deep British economic influence even without being British colonies. In 1902, a global telegraph network called the All Red Line was completed, connecting every British colony to London. For the first time in history, a single government could communicate instantly with territories spread across the entire planet. Part 8. Dominions, Home Rule, and the Question of Independence. As the empire grew richer and more connected, the question of independence began to rise from within. The colonies, with large white settler populations, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were becoming economically strong and politically confident. Canada was given the right to govern itself in 1867. Australia and New Zealand followed similar paths around 1900, becoming what were called dominions. They remained part of the empire and kept the British monarch as their head of state, but they controlled their own internal affairs almost entirely. Ireland was a much more complicated and painful case. The Irish had long resented British rule, and many Irish politicians spent decades pushing for some form of home rule, meaning the right to govern Ireland from an Irish parliament. Multiple bills were presented to the British Parliament, but all of them were defeated. The British government feared that allowing Irish independence would encourage other parts of the empire to do the same. Part 9. World Wars and the End of Empire. The threats that actually brought down the empire came from Germany, not from the colonies themselves. In 1914, the First World War broke out, and Britain turned immediately to the empire for help. More than 2.5 million men from the dominions and colonies volunteered or were called up to fight for king and country. Soldiers from Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and dozens of other territories gave their lives in the mud of France and on battlefields across the Middle East. Britain won the war, but victory came at a staggering cost. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, and the country's finances were severely damaged. The empire actually reached its greatest territorial size in 1921, when Britain took control of large parts of the former German and Ottoman empires as rewards for winning the war. But that same year, Ireland gained its independence. The cracks were beginning to show. Then, just 20 years later, the Second World War began. Once again, Britain called on the empire, and once again the colonies responded. But this time, the financial cost was even more devastating. By 1945, Britain was essentially bankrupt. It had borrowed enormous sums of money from the United States just to survive the war. It simply could not afford to maintain an empire that stretched across the entire globe any longer. What followed was the largest and fastest transfer of sovereignty in human history. Throughout the late 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and into the 1970s, colony after colony was granted independence. India and Pakistan became independent in 1947. Country after country across Africa and Asia followed in the decades that came after. The British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan called it the wind of change, and that is exactly what it was. Nearly 400 years of British colonial history came to an end within a single generation. Most of the newly independent nations chose to stay connected to Britain through a voluntary organization called the Commonwealth, which today includes over 50 countries. 14 of these nations still have the British monarch as their head of state. And in 1997, the most symbolic moment of all came when Britain handed Hong Kong back to China. For many people, that was the final closing of the book on the British Empire. But the legacy of the empire did not end in 1997, and it has not ended today. The English language is now the most widely spoken language on earth, used by more people than any other tongue in human history. British legal systems, administrative structures, customs, and cultural practices shaped the governments and societies of dozens of countries. The borders drawn by British mapmakers still define the shape of nations today, for better and for worse. The wealth that flowed into Britain during the era of empire built the cities, the universities, the railways, and the institutions that modern Britain still depends on. And Britain itself has been transformed by the empire's legacy, as people from every country that was once under British rule have made their homes on the very island where this whole extraordinary story began. The British Empire was built on ambition, on naval power, on trade, and on exploitation. It brought technology and connection to parts of the world that had been isolated, and it also brought violence, slavery, and the destruction of cultures and communities that had existed for thousands of years. Understanding it fully, honestly, and completely, that is something we are still working on today. Thank you for watching Backdoor Economics, the entire history of the British Empire. If this story made you think, share it, leave a comment, and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss the next one. History is not just the past. It is the foundation of everything happening right now. And at Backdoor Economics, we help you understand exactly how we got here.